All right. It is February 4th, 2024, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger. And today we've got two big topics we're going to cover and do quick hits in between those two topics. But it's going to be a shorter episode because of that. Um, Nevertheless, important topics we need to discuss. And the first thing we are going to cover is the ongoing Vince McMahon WWE lawsuit. Now, we're going to do a high level recap of what's going on with that and updates from the last time we talked about this. But what I really want to focus on today is how does Dana White and the UFC navigate this? Right? Your partner company has a massive scandal that is causing ripples throughout not only the company, but even the pro wrestling industry. You are tied to them. Your stock is tied to them. How do you navigate this as a partner company? What do you do? What can you do? You know, seeing as how TKO is also 51% owned by Endeavor, what ramifications are there from that angle? We're going to dive into all of that. That'll be topic one. Then, like I said, we're going to do quick hits and we're going to follow up quick hits with the UFC's promotional tactics. A lot of stir with the Dustin Poirier fight being on, being off, now being on again, and some of the promotional tactics that the UFC has used for quite a long time where they're announcing fights before they're technically signed. I'm going to talk about why the UFC does this. What is the business case or, use case for this? What advantage do they get? And what are the ramifications when things kind of blow up or fall through if, fighters don't end up actually signing on the dotted line? You don't get a resolution like you did with Dustin Poirier. So I'm going to talk about that as well. Um, Timestamps in the bottom as always. And let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, first thing we are going to talk about today is how does the UFC navigate this ongoing scandal in its partner company WWE? Just a high level recap of events, right? Um, Vince McMahon, who is, I would assume that if you're listening to this, you were at least aware of who Vincent McMahon is to WWE. And when he sold WWE to Endeavor, before he even sold WWE, right? There was a scandal. He basically left, was not forced out, but decided to leave. He had controlling shares of WWE. After a while, decided, nope, you know what? I want to come back. And all we knew at the time was just, hey, he's paid out multiple NDAs to multiple women. That's all we really knew. We didn't know the details or anything of that nature. So he leaves, decides after a while, nope, he wants to come back, forces his way back in. The WWE board originally unanimously votes that he doesn't come back in. He uses his voting share power to change the board, force his way back in, force the sale of the company uh, to Endeavor, who then, creates TKO, spins off the UFC into this new entity, dilutes his share power. So now I believe he has about 12% or so. Well, he had a little bit more than that, but then he sold some stock. So he's at 12% or so. But as part of the deal, and this is something Ari Emanuel, head of Endeavor, talked about is, we need Vince McMahon. He needs to stay on, want his creative mind, want him to be helpful. Um, After a while, with certain things going on, he was pulled from creative, but he was still orchestrating deals, just a couple months ago. He was the one, Vince McMahon was the one who, using his connections that he had set up with the WWE Saudi deal, really, tied together the UFC Saudi Arabia deal. Like he was a key part of that. So he is executive chairman of the board. He's not in creative anymore. He's doing all that. And then a former employee, one of these NDAs, um, basically files a lawsuit. And this is what one of the NDAs was supposed to stop, but didn't happen. And the details come out. They're horrific. Again, do not recommend reading them on a weak stomach, if you have a weak stomach, rather. And so all this comes out. McMahon is immediately coming under fire, um, causes a whole bunch of issues. And then WWE had their Royal Rumble pay per view this past weekend on the 27th and January 27th. And Slim Jim, who is one of, if not their biggest sponsor, right? Top three, decides to pull their sponsorship. Says, we're going to pause our sponsorship with the Royal Rumble given everything going on with Vince McMahon. It's reported by Fightful Select, who is a wrestling outlet that I generally trust. Um, that another major sponsor that they were in talks with no longer wants to work with them. So now money is being affected. Pretty shortly after that report comes out, I believe that's the morning of. Yeah, I think it's the day before. It's either the day before. Yeah, yeah. No, it has to be the day before. It's the Friday before the Royal Rumble, which is on Saturday. That comes out, and then during SmackDown, which is one of their shows, Vince McMahon resigns fully. Says, I still am going to defend myself against these baseless allegations, replete with lies, all this stuff. But for the good of the company, blah, 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 I'm going to resign. So he resigns. The next day, Slim Jim is back on board. I haven't heard anything else about the other sponsor, but you see the Royal Rumble Slim Jim is has several spots where they're clearly promoting their brand. Um, and it seems like, at least on the surface, all seems to be much better, right? This whole time everything's going on, the stock, TKO stock, had jumped from the Netflix deal that we talked about last week. It dropped a little bit, but not, hugely. Um, and then this past week, it pretty much evened out at around, I think, $85 or so is where it ended, and kind of spiked back up. And that's after a huge spike because of a big announcement. Seeing a drop from whatever it was, like 94, 95 down to 85, from where it was sitting at 77. That's not super uncommon at all, right? Especially because it ended the day after the announcement closer to 90-ish or 89. So it's dropped some, sure, but it's not what I would call a major red flag based on, the news of McMahon and things going on with that. And more, comes out about this and all as the details are being released, as coverage is actually blowing up in the mainstream. Because, wrestling is very much like MMA, where it's very niche and for the most part in terms of like daily coverage on who's winning which matches, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but you have the Wall Street Journal, CNN, uh, Vice, Fox, every news outlet under the sun that's, New York Times, that are bigger mainstream news outlets covering this, which is a big deal. And the stock is kind of like sitting sort of normalish, right? Um, Again, you have some loss, but not enough that you could attribute to, oh, this story is really rocking it, right? No, at least not when the initial NDA news came out, and the PFL news came out. Like, that really sent the stock down quite a bit and then on a downward trajectory. This seems to be the stock kind of leveling up off after a big upswing from the Netflix announcement. So it rides that wave. And again, as of Friday, seems to be in a stable-ish position. But another caveat that gets thrown into this is, apparently, the way the Royal Rumble works, for those of you who don't know, it's like this big battle royal match, and then the winner of that gets to go on to WrestleMania to challenge one of the company's champions. And so, you had a wrestler, Cody Rhodes, win that. Call out one of the champions, essentially, really call him out, and it was a continuation of a storyline type thing. And then on Friday, uh, in somewhat of a twist, he ends up basically giving away his shot against the guy he's been in the story he's been really after and who he seemed to want to go after post Royal Rumble to The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, who makes a surprise appearance. Crowd goes wild, blah blah blah, and they've set up this Rock versus Roman Reigns match, which is massive, etc. Again, not going to get into the details of that, but the reason I want to bring up the switch is it's being reported, at least from some outlets, and I don't know how much of this is truth or not, but um, from a couple of outlets, it is being reported that part of the reason that was made was because there was an injury to another wrestler at the Rumble. But beyond that, you know, part of this is to have The Rock come in, be at WrestleMania, and divert attention away from the Vince McMahon stuff, which is not terrible PR, right? That's not necessarily a bad move just to get more people, more of mainstream casual fans talking about, oh, this huge match in the making to distract from what's going on. I don't know how much of that is, where how much of that is truth and is the main reason. I don't know if we'll ever get a clear answer on, but I could see that being part of the strategy from WWE internally, right? Is like make as much positive noise as possible to drown out the negative noise. We've gotten rid of Vince McMahon. We're trying to, you know, have a huge WrestleMania. This is the way to do it. It's not an unused PR tactic, especially you know during the Royal Rumble. They have press conferences, kind of like MMA does, um, and you know Paul Levesque, who is their chief COO, chief operating officer, I believe, or CCO or something like that. He takes questions and did an awful job, a terrible, terrible, terrible job when asked about this by reporters, asked about the scandal. He basically said, "We had an amazing week. We're moving forward. We're not gonna focus on the negativity." And keep in mind, this dude is the son-in-law of the guy um, who just, you know, got kicked out of the company. He's married to that guy's daughter. His grandkid or his kids are Vince McMahon's grandkids. I mean, yeah. So he does a terrible job handling it. A couple of other wrestlers or figureheads did all right handling some questions, but um, that's kind of where things are now. I know that there's been a report of federal prosecutors, like executing a search warrant and really looking into Vince McMahon. So it looks like looking at criminal charges, which would make a lot of sense, providing how deep this goes. But that's kind of the high level recap in terms of where we are right now. For more in depth stuff, like timeline, all that fun stuff, some if you want to get into the real wrestling nitty gritty, and I know I went for a while there, but just wanted to make sure I hit the key points. Um, Check out either John Pollock or Brandon Thurston. Their show together, both of their shows separately are fantastic stuff. They're doing a great job covering this from the wrestling side. So if you want to get into the wrestling weeds and like get into the scandals itself and the history and some of the other, all that juicy, gory details, those guys are already killing it. I'm not going to try and dive into that world too much. To be honest, I don't have the time, and they're already doing a fantastic job. So go follow them for that. Um, but as it pertains to Endeavor, right, and the UFC, that's what I kind of want to focus on. For Endeavor, right, Ari Emanuel now is in a interesting position. When the NDA stuff had come out, they had put in their filings with the TKO merger, like this is a risk, right? Like depending on what happens with this they disclose that as a risk to shareholders. When all that stuff came out as well, when WWE was its own company, apparently they had an internal investigation with a third party, and they didn't reach out to, or there's some interesting communication as to whether or not they reached out to this alleged victim whose details have now come out. And so it doesn't look great, right? It seems to be of much more of an issue, right, than probably previously thought. And how much somebody like Ari Emanuel or Nick Khan, who's over there, knew is hard to say. But from Ari's perspective now, you immediately have to lock down again as much negative PR as you can. Got to spin it, and you've got to clean house. And we've seen Ari do this on the MMA side before, right? I know I've seen some wrestling journalists or places talk about like, well, are they going to get rid of Paul Levesque, who is a key centerpiece in terms of creative designs of the stories of pro wrestling and all this other stuff, and all this, when Ari bought the UFC and Endeavor bought the UFC, right? They cleaned house like no other, and there was not some major scandal going on. Um, they just wanted to cut bloat. Right, remember all the Legends deals that were going on? Chuck Liddell, who maybe Rashad Evans? No, Matt Hughes, Chuck Liddell, a couple others, where they were getting these, crazy deals, crazy amounts of money for doing nothing, essentially, right? They were not coming into an office, they were not doing anything. The only person who survived that initial round of cuts was Forrest Griffin because he actually, like, showed up to the office and tried to do a job. He tried to, like, actually do something. And then he ended up, being an integral part of the PI and, actually work with athletes. And so they were like, yeah, we'll keep you on because you're actually doing something. But you had so many Legends deals, so many things going on where people were just getting paid because, Dana and the Fertitas had essentially agreed to pay these guys and like these company men. And then that all went away just overnight, just poof. Ari has always been about the numbers and about focus. His recent comments, right, about CAA, who is a rival of WMEIMG, going private and getting paid a ton of money and their stock being valued at something, right? His recent comments were, I want my stock valued at that. We're at least worth, forget what he said. Maybe he didn't say 10 times or 8 times whatever CAA got, but he said, at least 4 or 5 times what our valuation is. This is crazy, blah, blah, blah. He's trying to pump up his stock price. He's trying to get his respect from that regard, but that's just always how he's worked. He's always been about cut the glut, trim the fat, and make this as profitable as possible, pump up our shares. And the fact Endeavor stock has not done super well since appearing on Wall Street, I think is a thorn in his side. I think that's something he takes. I don't know if it's personally, but I could see it, right? Like, I mean, he definitely, it irks him to a certain degree. Um, and this, right, with TKO, this was something that was going to help Endeavor stock by offloading a fair amount of their debt. Bringing together two powerhouse names in WWE and UFC, use those back office synergies, which we've seen through layoffs, specifically on the WWE side. And now we're finally seeing the co-promotion of events, right? You got, I think, 298, UFC 298, and a big, house show or Raw or something that weekend. And now we're finally seeing the kind of co-promotion of like, yeah, check out this weekend. You can get two huge things of wrestling and MMA. And they're trying to increase the cross pollination of customers, right? Like, basically, I'm sure they've done research on this. I know the research I've heard is like 5 to 10%, but I've sh- I'm sure they've done some casual research on this that suggests that there might be opportunity to get more crossover between MMA and WWE fans, right? Especially if you have, someone like Brock Lesnar, who is also named in this case, by the way, and has all but been removed from WWE. But you know that somebody like him is an opportunity where, okay, he can fight, but he also wrestles. And so you can kind of do some cross promotion. We saw Cain Velasquez before his whole ordeal, go over to WWE for a bit and do an angle with Brock Lesnar and do a whole thing. Um, there's certainly some opportunity there where they'd like those two sides to work a little bit better, I think, and to hopefully get more customers to go to both, especially if they're in the same weekend, right? It's an experience. That's what they're trying to build. Um, how far that'll go, that's yet to tell, but that's definitely something they want to push. This is the start, the co-promotion that they're doing. But Ari now is in a position where, looking at what's happening in WWE, he pretty much has to clean house, and he will. Anybody that is even remotely involved in this, and the lawsuit named McMahon, but then there's several other members of WWE who are anonymously mentioned, right? Like corporate member number one, think an athletic trainer, a referee, maybe a particular wrestler. There's a whole bunch named in just this lawsuit, and there are many other lawsuits. And the question becomes too, is this the worst of them, or is this the standard? If we open up these other NDAs, if this NDA, which is going to court, and part of it could become unenforceable, right? Like if a judge rules it unenforceable, that could open up basically all the other NDAs where women could come forward and actually reveal details. The lawyer for this particular woman says that they've had several people come forward and want to talk about this, and it's a rotten culture, uh, that they're overwhelmed by this. There's been a lot of rumblings from reporters talking to people apparently and saying like this thing is real bad all over the place. And again, we're going to find out how bad to an extent. But Ari has to swiftly, Ari and Endeavor and the board of TKO has to swiftly get rid of anyone who might be even potentially involved in this. Because if more details come out, if it turns out that key people who are still in the company right now, um, because again, McMahon was kind of there, kind of not, right? Ronda Rousey mentioned, he through an agent of Bruce Pritchard, he was still kind of, there, quote unquote, through a surrogate, but McMahon himself wasn't physically in the building, wasn't physically doing things, and really was focusing more on things like the Saudi deal in UFC rather than, um, actually running the show. If it turns out that there are people who are running the show are still there, and lots of people, that's going to cause huge problems. Because in this, woman, this Janelle Grant is her name. In her lawsuit, she names the WWE. And if it turns out that this is a systemic problem, right? That yes, McMahon is the perpetrator or the key perpetrator. I believe John Laurinaitis is also named, who is a key figure there for many years. But if it turns out, okay, this is a systemic failure, it isn't just two people at the top abusing their power, that lawsuit becomes very expensive very quickly. And couple that with NDAs not being enforceable, and you've got multiple of these. I mean, it could go very bad very quickly for WWE. So Ari has to immediately figure this out with TKO's board and l- get rid of anyone who even remotely might have been involved in this. Um, and that's going to bring a lot of hard changes, right? I don't know how, personally, just from an optic standpoint, I don't know how Paul Levesque stays on, because I mean, it would be hard given his relationship and given some of the stories out there, that he would be unaware of. He might not know, again, all of the details, but he'd be unaware of some of this stuff. kind of seems like a no-brainer. And that could again affect WWE's storyline, right? That's firing your head writer for a TV show, or your head showrunner for a TV show. That's not great. Um, so it's a lot, and Endeavor's going to have to navigate that. And TKO could easily, right now their stock's doing okay. They could easily end up in trouble. So from the UFC side of things, um, just to circle this all back, and I know I've kind of gone on some tangents here, but it's important to set this up right. Um, from the UFC side of things, what does Dana and the UFC do? Right now, their only tie is to Brock Lesnar. That's their main tie-in to this whole situation. Is he had Brock Lesnar come back for UFC 200. He's a former UFC World Heavyweight Champion. Um, I have said many times I thought Brock Lesnar was going to come back for UFC 300 in the main event, which still hasn't been announced. So I thought they were trying to work on that. If that was even being talked about, and yes, I know Dana said he wasn't, but yeah, I mean, Dana said he wasn't for 200 too, so you can't always trust that. Um, Either way, I now think that's definitely not happening. I do not think Dana and co would want to touch this at all. So now would not be the time to bring back Brock. But that's your biggest tie-in. Rousey is also a tie-in, right? But the UFC's kind of distanced themselves from Rousey since the Hall of Fame, and since she kind of gave up, and Rousey made much more of a clean split, right? There's been rumors about her coming back, but we'll see. Honestly, if you one easy, PR tactic is if Rousey coming back was on the table for 300, that's not a bad call, right? Because that's, getting that definitely is like we're, getting an empowering woman to come and step into the cage. It gives her shine. I mean, that could be a whole thing, but that's kind of, I don't think that's going anywhere. And I don't believe it would give so much of a PR shine that it's really like, oh, this is great, right? Um, so making sure you don't bring back Brock Lesnar is step one. That's easy. He's not going to be at 300. He's not going to be, part of, if you've got any UFC documentary stuff on him or some happening in the background, that all stops immediately. You keep him off the radar for right now. See how it plays out, because his involvement is kind of wonky, right? It's the details of that are definitely seems like he was kind of involved, but how involved, it's hard to say, and all that stuff. So um you just basically you don't bring him back. That's easy enough to do at this point too, especially given his age. It's pretty simple. Uh, but beyond that, right? If you're the UFC, you're in a very unique and interesting position. The Really what you have to put now above all else, given what's going on with WWE and that RA and TKO are dealing with, that is you have to make sure that you do not have any very awful negative press scandal type things come out anytime soon. Right? WWE sinking could hypothetically sink the whole ship, although given the UFC's profitability, I don't think it would. Um, but it's definitely, if WWE really went off the deep end here, right? And just let's say it turns out like this thing stuff is going on everywhere all the time. It's still technically going on today, something crazy like that. And WWE now gets hit with endless lawsuits that are going to cost a ton of money and really just drain the company. And it's a whole huge thing, and viewership drops off, customers leave, all that stuff. Apocalyptic scenario, right? UFC's profitability, because they are so profitable, um, I have to go look at the actual numbers, but I think there would be a chance they could survive, especially because TKO would probably clean house in ways by cutting certain things or shutting down parts of operations and all that. So they'd be, I think they would have a pulse. What state they'd be in, I'm not sure, but you know, UFC is not burning money in unprofitable, in a way where it's like, okay, if WWE goes to UFC can't do anything and TKO is dead. Um, I think they definitely have a pulse, minimum, honestly. Now that I'm thinking through things, yeah, they'd be alive. But so with the antitrust lawsuit starting right in a couple months now, that's bad enough. If there's any other scandal thing or whatever, you're even remote something that you think could remotely creep up and cause a whirlwind of negative press, you're locking that down right now. If you're Dana White and Co, you're also escalating that. If again, I'm not talking about a scandal necessarily the size of this magnitude with Vince McMahon and everything else going on, but if you got some crazy scandal or something bubbling under the surface that could potentially come out, could cause issues, you are raising that up right now to TKO's board and to RA, and you're saying, "Hey, look, I know you're dealing with all this crap, but like here's a risk that we have to keep an eye on." You're taking a risk register and creating a risk register of everything at the UFC level that could cause issue, especially with PR. Now, Sean Strickland stuff isn't great, right? And obviously they didn't have him available after his fight, which was interesting. Um, After he dropped the belt, but yeah, you definitely need to be careful about that. I know Dana. Last time we talked, Dana leaned into it. That's his consumer base, that's his fan base. He said he's not going to censor anybody. Sure, that still doesn't mean you don't do things like remove him from media access after a fight where he might get asked more questions or it might cause more issues, right? You do what you can to mitigate those risks. And that's not, especially given how it all played out, that's not a risk on the same level as McMahon's issues, right? But any extra negative attention right now is going to be, they're going to be extra sensitive to it. And that's what you kind of have to realize moving forward if you're Dana. Um, and I keep saying Dana, but it's really just the UFC business as a whole, right? If you have any USADA, like the new, not USADA anymore, but the new drug testing program, if you have any failures or any issues with that, you need to immediately shore them up and you need to raise risks. You are on heightened alert essentially, because the spotlight is on WWE and as an extension on TKO, and you are half of TKO. So making sure your house is in order is step one, and escalating any type of risk and managing that far more stringently than you had before is step one. Um, Step two, right? Once you've kind of got that settled and sorted, then you've got to do the winning and the lifting for TKO. So you need to be putting on huge events, ideally. You need to create a lot of positive buzz about what you're doing, going into new markets, new sponsorship deals, things of that nature. And you need to put on exciting fights, sell out arenas, things of that nature. You've got to go out there and win. Your partner is down. You've got to pick up the slack because this is going to cost a lot of money. It's going to cost a lot of negative publicity. We've seen with WWE how it could cost sponsorships. You're going to have to pick up that slack. That's not something the UFC is unfamiliar with, though, right? When they were in Endeavor's portfolio and Endeavor bought them out fully, I mean, they were the crown jewel. We talked about that on the show. They were the one fueling Endeavor's acquisitions of, On Location and the sports IMG arena, right? They were the crown jewel of Endeavor's ecosystem. because a lot of that ecosystem was just burning money or barely profitable or was incurring a ton of debt in order to acquire new parts of the ecosystem they believed in. And it was up to the UFC to just keep making money, paying down Endeavor's debt with its profits, paying out dividends um, to certain shareholders. Right, there was the New York Post article that was about the dividends to a lot of celebrities, things of that nature, who had invested in the company. But that's, I mean, that was really the UFC's role then was like, all right, we're gonna go out there and keep winning and killing it while you guys figure your stuff out. So they're back in that position again. Instead of being toe and toe with, a partner who is also very profitable and they can kind of not relax because they're always trying to grow and succeed, but they don't have the same pressure or same role as before. Um, Now they're back to where they were when Endeavor owned them outright. That's really they're back in that mode. So also wouldn't be surprised, seeing more U- UFC Vegas 85 fight nights and then big events, which they already came out with three, huge pay per views coming up with 289, 299, 300, which are all very good. 297 was not so much, but the next three are. They're going to have a big, you know, first half of the year for sure. And then you've got rumors about Conor McGregor coming back for International Fight Week, which makes a lot of sense. Would again help with the press, help with boosting positive, if you know, coverage of the UFC and take away from negative TKO coverage. So they're going to do that, but that's you're back in that. Okay, I've got to win role. Well, my partners and everything is down. I've got to win. Fine. That's easy enough too for them. That's not very different at all from they were just, a year and a half ago. Right? That's their this is where they've been for a while. So they took a break from it, now they're back. So that's the next thing they have to do. And then lastly, the biggest thing you do here is from a specifically talking head point, which this would be mostly Dana, I would imagine. Maybe Lawrence Epstein, maybe Hunter, but not really. Hunter rarely does interviews and things of that nature. So mostly Dana is if the WWE stuff comes up, you have a company line that you toe and you stick to it and you make sure that to what extent you can, you make sure fighters stick to it too, right? If it bleeds into UFC stuff. So far, it hasn't. I'm not saying it will. I think there is technically a possibility with the Brock stuff. And just again, the fact that if, TKO shares tank, that affects UFC. And so that becomes an issue. And I'm sure it could come up. But, you toe the company line here and you have a unified front on this stuff. Uh, because again, the UFC has had plenty of scandals, right? Plenty of scandals. Most recent one being the video of Dana White slapping his wife, and you had ESPN talking about it. You had video of him doing that. I think he got some grace given that his wife had also hit him, right? So that gave him a little bit more of a grace period to get out of that situation, and he was able to answer questions in a way that allowed him to pretty much stay where he was. I think if his wife does not hit him, or you get, just the video of him slapping his wife or really going after his wife, I think that's curtains for him. But UFC knows how to navigate scandals. They've been through plenty of them, and they've just kind of got to go into that mode and make sure that they maintain what they're doing. Other than that, there's not much else the UFC can do, right? I mean, they're kind of stuck. Um, it's not like now, which this is important moving forward, where now you're going to have some of these same back office roles fulfilled by the same like business unit. That's part of the synergies. Is that with some of the layoffs? Sponsorship, I think is the biggest one, but there's marketing, some other places where like now you've got one team working on certain graphics for both WWE and UFC, and it becomes kind of a merger of the corporate office, back office structure. Now that's important too. That if that culture is coming in from WWE, that if you UFC, you get rid of it ASAP. And TKO knows that, I'm sure, but you make sure that does not permeate into your company tactics and builds, right? And I don't think I don't believe they've had any like actual office mergers where they're sending people from Vegas up to Connecticut or anything like that. I don't think that's happening. I think mostly things are remote, or so that'll help with some of it. But you stonewall if you're the UFC. You say nope. This is our culture. This is our brand. This is what we built, and you do not let anything. If it is truly a systemic culture issue in WWE, you don't let anything penetrate what you've built in UFC's culture. You make sure that that is locked down in a way to prevent that from bleeding into the MMA side. That's really all you can do are those things. It Other than that, again, it's kind of like watching, a fire across the street. You can call, you know, you can call your fire department. You can watch it and try to help where you can, but ultimately, like it's not your building that's on fire. It's that building, and they have to figure it out, right? Um, and yeah, will this affect things from a governance standpoint? Sure. I'm sure that certain things will be put into place to prevent this from ever happening in WWE again. That will also be adopted by the UFC. You've got The Rock joining the TKO board, which means he can technically vote and speak to things that involve the UFC as well. So that automatically changes some of the governance. With McMahon out, that's just also going to happen. Um, there are going to be changes that will ultimately trickle down to the UFC side that they'll have to deal with. But right now, there's not much they can do other than go out and just do well. That's their biggest goal, and then tighten things up, raise risks, everything we just talked about. That's kind of how you navigate this if you're the UFC. Um, you keep communication open, especially with Ari and Co. You do what you offer assistance, but you're kind of in your own world, and it's important for you to succeed in that world while this is going on. That's from a business perspective, right? Um, Similar type of thing in a way to, I guess, the bow on this topic is, think about like with a family, right? If you've got a family with two brothers and one brother is messing up all the time, and I know some of you come from families like that. I'm lucky. I'm lucky. If anybody was the mess up, it was me in mine. But when that did happen, right? Like when I would mess up, or there'd be issues, you know, my older brother would, be the good kid, would be the one not getting into trouble, and would know like I'm, basically my parents would essentially be like, look, we got to deal with your brother. And we have a whole bunch of stuff we got to deal with your brother, or whatever, what have you. You know, we need you to, get good grades and not go out and party and not do these things, right? That's the expectation. That's all you can do. That's if you're the good kid, that's all you can do is just keep being the good kid. Make sure you don't get in trouble. That's step number one. Because if you get in trouble in the boat, like then it's a huge issue, right? Then your whole house is on fire and it's a big problem. But if it's just one section of the family, you can tackle it and figure out how to go through it. It makes a huge difference. That's the analogy I would give. I know I'm not the best at analogies, but that's kind of what I would say is, if you've got the problem child, the good kid has to remain being the good kid. And yeah, you switch on and off sometimes, right? But like you got two kids, you hope and you expect one to be good while you're dealing with the other's problems as much as you can. That's the best way to support the family. That's what TKO and R is going to be looking for the UFC to do. And that's what Dana and Co will do. That's what the UFC will do moving forward. Um, I have no doubt that's going to be their goal anyway. So, with that in mind, let me know your thoughts on all this. I know this was a long one, but it was important to talk about because, again, ramifications of this will affect the UFC peripherally, at least for right now. But governance is going to be policies. I'm sure will be put in place that will have to be put in the UFC because they're put in WWE, and it will come from a top-down governance structure. A TKO governance itself is changed, and my guess will continue to change. I don't see day-to-day operations or anything being affected in the UFC side. I think again, it's more likely now if they were looking at any UFC cuts to kind of balance out some of the WWE cuts, they're probably not looking at those as much right now and seeing WWE as more of the problem. So there's that. But yeah, it's going to be an interesting ride, and we'll see what the stock does, and we'll see what UFC does to try and counter and succeed on their side because that's all they can really do. All right, quick hits, and these will be very quick. Two things I want to point out. One is that Victor Cui is back at one championship. That's a big deal. He was kind of beloved at one, had left, I believe, to do a CFL or AFL football league thing. Has come back to help kind of right the ship. And Chaudhry was asked about financials. One's financials mentioned he's gotten about $500 million in investment, and that they're succeeding. They're going to be profitable soon. I saw a lot of people saying like, "Oh, I mean, UFC has a lock on the market so much that $500 million Chaudhry has, and he still can't you know compete." And that's it's not an entirely true statement, right? There are lots of caveats with that, but it does speak to the UFC's market power, and it is something that may come up at the antitrust lawsuit. It's not great that they get $500 million and they can't get a functioning MMA promotion to really compete at the level as the UFC. That's from a you know antitrust standpoint, something to think about. But Victor being back again is big, especially with the other executives that left. Him coming back is a good signal, at least in terms of the company bringing back a beloved figure that I'm guessing they believe will help them move into this new era of profitability and expand into the U.S. The other quick hit I wanted to go through would be that ESPN Plus, along with Hulu and Disney in general, are following the Netflix model and are going to start cracking down on password sharing. So just like where Netflix you used to be able to share your password and one, account may have several people tied to it, that's now gone on Netflix's side, and it's sunsetting, I believe, in March for ESPN Plus. That's big because, again, UFC media rights deals are coming up, right? This is the exclusive negotiating period, and then they start to get to talk with other entities. So, how much that affects subscribership, I think, could easily impact the UFC's rights deal, um, depending, right? If it's a statistically insignificant amount, sure, they don't care. If anything, that just helps ESPN because it's great. We got these guys. That means we're going to force them to sign up for their own. Perfect. If it's a ton, which I don't know that it will be, but again, it's a possibility, right? If all of a sudden you have a bunch of subscription cancellations, or you have those same subscriptions, but then, viewership starts dropping for UFC events because again, we get viewership through ratings, but there's ESPN Plus numbers we are not privy to, right? Where they can tally it on the back end. If you're streaming, you can see how many are concurrently streaming something that they keep those numbers pretty under lock and key. That's part of the reason and the way the UFC makes their decisions about who to push or not, right? It's a big deal. So if those numbers start falling significantly, right, or pay per view numbers are affected a ton, which shouldn't happen, you'd think. But you never know. Then that could, play a part in this. I don't think it will personally. I think it's going to be kind of like Netflix, where like, sure, you lose subscribers or people get mad about it, or less viewership, but overall pretty much stays the same because people want to see their sports and whatever. But ESPN Plus is in a weird spot because Netflix, right, has always had that content, and if you're going to watch Netflix, that's the content you want. ESPN Plus has been a part of the bundle a lot of the times and has been more pushed as, yeah, it's got UFC, it's got a couple of games here and there, but it's not the quintessential ESPN network. So until they transfer that over, that'll be a thing too. But just something to keep an eye on. Those are the quick hits. Let me know if I missed anything else. Oh yeah, Riz Pharma. That's the last one. Riz Pharma is now signed a sponsorship for the UFC for erectile dysfunction and some other male needs. Low to mid seven figures, so not like a crazy deal, but uh, interesting nonetheless. They've always been in this space. There's been people laughing about it and talking about it with Trojan and Condom Depot and that stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's quite the name, Riz Pharma, but it's a sponsorship deal nonetheless, and it's another feather in the cap of that sponsorship team, which they are again consolidating and trying to get one team together, from my understanding, for both WWE and UFC, which is big because sponsorship is a huge part of making money for both of those companies. So another feather in the cap there. Let me know if I missed anything, but those are the quick hits for the week. All right. Last thing I'm going to touch on for today is got another classic case of, um, you know, Dustin Poirier versus uh, Benoit Saint Denis, announced for 299, and seems like everything's great until Dustin says nope, fights off, but I'm still training. Comes a whole issue where they're saying nope, it's not signed. You had a whole thing on Twitter happening, and then Dustin comes back and says nope, sorry, I jumped the gun. We're good. I just couldn't get a hold of my manager, etc. And people were getting upset. Dana was going after a couple. Dana and Co were going after Guillermo Cruz, I believe, which I still don't understand what that was all about. But essentially, saying, nope, this fight is done. It's a whole thing. Um, I believe because he had reported that and another fight had never actually been signed and it was announced. Um, so with the Poirier situation, I don't know if it was signed or not, and it just didn't get communicated, whatever. But we know from other situations, right, in the past, in the UFC lawsuit documents, that this has happened before. And we've seen this happen before where fighters have come out and said, like, I didn't sign this deal. They just announced this fight. We've seen it, especially more frequently, right? And it's important to track because this is something that I think will continue to happen, and it gives the UFC a slight advantage in marketing and for promotion. And here's why. If you are able to announce an exciting fight, right, ahead of time for a particular card, you're going to get people buying those tickets, and it's always card subject to change, right? It always card subject to change. So one, you try and pressure those fighters to make that matchup because that's the matchup you want, right? And now if it's out there and they say no, it looks like they backed out or they're scared to fight. So it's a psychological and appearance tactic to be like, hey, you guys are going to sign this and fight. If not, like you're going to look dumb or it's going to be your fault. You're going to get the blame, which often happens, right? It even look at the Poirier situation. Poirier is like, nope, our fight's off. We couldn't come to a contractual agreement. Makes it sound like, and a lot of people were saying, well, it sounds like he didn't want to fight Benoit and I couldn't get it done. That's the whole reason they do that, is to spin it that way. It's not, man, we're the UFC. We couldn't get this fight done. We really wanted it, blah, blah, blah. It's no. And in the meantime, right, you're going to have diehard Dustin Poirier fans or people who are like, okay, I want to see who's on this card before I buy tickets to go to 299. Oh, that fight's added. That's big. So now when I'm looking at the whole card, great. It's a hardcore fan. Now it kind of like hits that tipping level of, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and buy my flights, all this. So even if it gets canceled, Oh, well, that sucks. That fight's off. That's whatever. Well, I already bought the tickets, I already bought the flights, I already bought the hotels. Like, yeah, I'm still going. It just sucks it's gone. It's that simple. I do not understand why people are scratching their heads like, why would the UFC do this? This is how you sell cards. And they can get away with it because again, it's not a situation where they're knowingly throwing these cards on and saying like, nope, this isn't going to actually happen. So they're not committing fraud or lying about it. They're saying, no, we believe that this is the fight that's going to happen. We're announcing this fight because this is the fight we want. This is the fight where it's happening. Contracts are out. They just have to sign. And I do wonder what would happen if somebody challenged that, right? Of like, oh, this is purposefully. When you look at some of the texts and things that were going on when the John Jones situation, which they announced Gustafson versus Jones before Jones had actually had the contract and signed everything. I wonder if somebody sues if that fight fell through and then sues the UFC for false advertising. I don't know how that would go, um, but as of right now, they can continue to do this, and it gives them the ability to move tickets and move promotion faster while they're waiting for the fighters to sign and be making the fights they want, right? Like if you're a fighter, I've seen this a lot recently, and it's important to note that if you are fighting for the UFC, you can turn down an opponent. There seems to be this notion out there from multiple people. Stephen A. Smith mentioned it. Eddie Hearn mentioned it in a discussion with I think Yale or with the college discussion that John Nash had put out there. That was great. It's good to look at for boxing negotiations versus MMA negotiations. Check it out. Um, but all of these people are saying no. Like, well, the UFC gets to decide who fights who. They say, oh, this guy, you're going to fight that guy. Sign the contract. But as a fighter, you can still turn them down. Now, if you turn them down, you can get your contract extended. It can become a whole thing. But you know, especially I think it's after so many offers, like 2 or 3 offers, depending on who you are, depending on your contract. But it's not a like you have to fight this person. If you say no, then y- you know, too bad, you're in trouble, etc. Like that's not how it works. That's often how it feels. And that I mean, if you don't say yes, it can have ramifications, but you can turn down opponents. That is a thing you can do. But by announcing these fights again ahead of time, if you turn down the opponent, the narrative is going to be spun as well, we made it, we thought we were good, and then this person didn't want to fight this person, and that doesn't look good for you, right? It causes issue for you. And again, what is stopping the UFC from continuing to do this? What is the you always have to look at this from a cost benefit analysis. Every move that they make, right? On the proverbial chessboard, what is the risk if I do this? What's the risk if they continue to announce these fights and then they're not signed and then they fall through? Fans get grumpy, media says it's a problem. Big whoop that blew over in a day. How many people bought tickets and actually moved money, right? I think the only way it blows up is if you announce some crazy main event for, say, UFC 300, and then it falls through last second and turns out, well, it was never actually signed. Then you've got problems. But those aren't the fights, where that tends to happen all the time. And I'm not saying, again, Jones Gustafson, Poirier is a bigger name, sure, but like it's it's a scenario where they're going to keep doing this because there's basically no downside. There's only upside. It only moves tickets, moves promotion, tries to force fighters into matchups you want. This is why would they ever abandon this tactic? Why? I can't. If somebody, I would love in the chat or message me on Twitter, whatever. Like, tell me why the UFC wouldn't continue to do this. They've been doing it for so long now. What is the downside? There is none. There's none at all. It's just free promotion and free moving tickets. It makes the card look better. You're good to go. Hopefully they sign it, and oftentimes they do sign it, right? We've heard fighters say like, "Well, that hadn't been official yet, but then we worked it out." There you go. And then you get to announce it earlier, which means you move more tickets up front. That's the name of the game, right? We going back to WWE, using that example, right? Like if you can announce that The Rock or John Cena or whoever, Stone Cold Steve Austin is going to be doing something, the sooner you announce it, the better because it moves more tickets, right? Uh, it there is no downside to the UFC right now other than fighters getting frustrated, sure, which that can have a systemic effect if enough fighters get mad. But for the most part, they just get mad and don't do anything. And media and some fans getting angry, but they again, media is still covering it, and fans with the market share the UFC has, fans are still watching, and they're going to blame the fighter most likely. They're going to see so and so is off because they wouldn't sign the contract. That's how Dana's going to spin it. That's how the other fighter's camp is going to spin it. Right? That's just how it is. There's no downside. So let me know in the chat again if you think there's a true downside to this, but it's smart on the UFC's end. It's a great promotional tactic for them. They're using their competitive advantages to pull this off, and there's no reason they're going to stop. So yeah, sorry, it's gonna keep happening. It's just gonna keep happening. Um, yeah, I literally can't think of a reason why they would stop. Let me know. Let me know what you guys think because it's seems like an easy question to answer to me. All right, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Appreciate you as always for watching on YouTube or listening through one of your preferred listening podcasts. It's late here, so apologize. Also apologize if the audio is a little wonky. Hopefully, it's all good. But yeah, I'm getting stuffed up. My voice is kind of going from the sick stuff, so I'm gonna bounce. But as always, like, subscribe, bell notifications if you're on YouTube, listening on any of the other uh, Apple, Spotify, what have you, podcast platforms. Appreciate you guys as always, and until next time, get money.